Hello. I'm going to bring an important message today from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we come across a number of prophets, and very often they had a difficult job because they were called to speak fearlessly, knowing that they could be opposed or misunderstood. God's prophets had to speak loudly and memorably because communication in those days much more difficult than communication in the 21st century. So we're going to turn to the book of Ezekiel. Most of us, if we're honest, rarely turn to this book, but we're looking at Ezekiel chapter 37 today, which is relevant to people in lockdown. And so I'm going to hand over to Emily, who's going to bring us our Bible reading, which is Ezekiel 37, verses 1 to 14.
The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me to and fro among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, "Son of man, can these bones live?" I said, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." Then he said to me, "Prophesy to these bones and say to them, Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am Lord." So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, "Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, Son of Man, and say to it, This is what the Sovereign Lord says. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live." So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood upon their feet, a vast army. Then he said to me, "Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, Our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone, we are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, This is what the Sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open up your graves and bring you from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then, my people, you will know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and then I will settle in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord."
Thank you, Emily. So, occasionally something happens which affects you and perhaps others, and at times the whole of the country. Maybe when a new government is formed, perhaps when there is a terrorist attack, or maybe when there is a pandemic, which of course is very relevant for now. Well, as we look in the Old Testament today, as we look at this passage that Emily has read to us, let me give you a little bit of background, that the southern kingdom of Israel had been defeated, we know historically, in the year 597 BC. Initially, 10,000 people were taken to Babylon, including a man or a young man called Ezekiel. He was a young trainee priest, and it seemed like the end of his hopes. He aspired to be a priest. It probably wouldn't happen in exile in Babylon. So, Ezekiel went to Babylon, and it took him 4 years to reinvent himself. When he became 30, he was called by God to be a prophet rather than a priest. So he had to reinvent himself, and it took him a long time to discover what he should be doing. Well, in lockdown, it seems to me that many people have had to reinvent themselves. People who used to be in full-time work perhaps are furloughed and maybe have become volunteer workers in some capacity. For some people, they've ended up decorating their house or working in the garden. For many of you listening today, you've gone through this experience of having to reinvent yourself in lockdown. Well, this man, Ezekiel, had to reinvent himself in exile. Instead of becoming a priest, he became a prophet. So he became a prophet, and let me tell you that he wasn't particularly popular in his new role. Do you know why? Because he only preached one message. Week after week, month after month, year after year, he preached the same message, and it was a message of judgment, God's certain judgment. And this he preached over and over again. And you understand, people didn't want to hear this message, but he persisted and he continued to preach that message. And then, after the city and the temple of Jerusalem were destroyed in the year 587 BC, after 6 years of preaching this message of judgment, God called him to preach differently. Now, I find that very interesting. Do you know why? Because I'd like to give a word of personal testimony, because something similar has happened to me. I've been in the city of Coventry and leading a church here for the last 6 years. And in that 6 years, I have been preaching to God's people. And I believe that, like Ezekiel, after 6 years of preaching in a certain way, God is now calling me to preach differently. So let's get back to Ezekiel. I've given you the context. We now turn to chapter 37, where Ezekiel is given a vision. And in this vision, God commands him to go to a strange valley, a valley of bones. And while he's there, God asks him a question whether these bones can live. And Ezekiel gives a very guarded answer. He says, well, Lord, you alone know. So, I'd like you to meet Fred. Meet Fred. Here he is. Isn't he cute? This is Fred. Well, Fred. Hello, Fred. How are you? You all right? Okay. Fred normally lives in a local school, but today you're getting out, Fred. It's really good to see you. And Fred has been given permission to be with us for these moments as I preach this sermon, and as this sermon is recorded. It's just great to have you with us, Fred. So, this is Fred, and Fred is disappearing now. See you a bit later. Let's think about Ezekiel's vision, in which he was taken to a valley of bones. And we need to recognize that Ezekiel, like anybody else, had limitations. And you see, within his vision, God calls him to preach. God calls him to preach to the bones in the valley, a strange thing to do. But Ezekiel is obedient, and he does this. He preaches to these dry bones, and miraculously, tendons and flesh are added, but there is still no life. And it really is almost a symbol of Ezekiel's preaching in the previous 6 years to lifeless people. His preaching was really not making any difference. So Ezekiel's preaching on the one hand is quite effective, but on the other hand it is limited, because even though he preaches to the bones and the tendons and the flesh are added, there's still no life. So Ezekiel has to have another go. He has to have another go. He has to preach again. And this time he preaches differently. This time he calls on the Spirit of God to breathe life into man's nostrils. And what a difference! We read in the passage that an army is mobilized as a result of Ezekiel's preaching. What does that say about preaching, by the way? Well, I hope that you recognize that preaching still has a place in today's modern world. And what we need to say about preaching is that preaching sometimes can have an impact on those that hear and sometimes doesn't. by itself, it generally has little impact. What we desperately need in the Church of God today is preaching which is truly anointed, preaching which is backed up by prayer. When that happens, that kind of preaching can bring transformation as God speaks through the preacher and through the message. And second time round, that is exactly how Ezekiel preaches. So, Ezekiel preaches, and God's breath comes into the nostrils of what were formerly dry bones, now becomes an army within this vision. So, where are we today? Well, we're in lockdown, aren't we? We're in lockdown, and most of you listening today, most of you long for normality. That's what you long for. You miss normality. You feel frustrated because there is really no end in sight to many of the abnormalities. Well, what was happening with the Israelites? Well, they were dispirited. Why were they dispirited? Because they were in exile. And they had been in exile for 10 years. 10 years. So I'm asking you the question whether you are dispirited in lockdown after nearly 10 weeks in lockdown. How are you coping? Let me say to you that it seems to me that we should make the most of every moment that God gives us. We shouldn't be dreaming about the future. We should be making the most of now and the opportunities we have to serve the Lord. So Ezekiel brings a prophecy. He brings a prophecy here in Ezekiel chapter 37, which gives hope to the exiles. That though there was no immediate end in sight, what he was predicting is that one day the nation of Israel will be resurrected and restored. Hallelujah. And Ezekiel prophesies the coming of God's Spirit. What does he do in this prophecy? He glimpses a future golden age. A future golden age when God's Spirit will breathe life into men and women under the rule of the Messiah, no less. And this weekend, we celebrate Pentecost. We celebrate Pentecost, when God's Spirit was poured out onto the first believers and followers of Jesus Christ, and the Church of God was born. Ezekiel, his whole message actually through this long book, his whole message can be summed up very simply. God will destroy. God will destroy. God will destroy. But once Jerusalem has been destroyed, another part of the message, God will rebuild. God will rebuild. God will rebuild. God has always acted in ways to get the attention of men and women like us. And I believe that God has allowed this coronavirus in order to shake the nations, in order to get people's attention, to tell them what he expects of them. And what does he expect of us today? He wants us to be Spirit-filled people. We need to know that as we think about the day of Pentecost and what happened 2,000 years ago on that glorious day. He wants us to be Spirit-filled people. Are you a Spirit-filled person today as you listen to this message? Well, you can be. He wants us to be Spirit-filled people. He wants us to trust him about an uncertain future. Will you do that or not? And finally, brothers and sisters, he wants us to please him. He wants us to please him. And what that means, in pleasing him, it means that we don't necessarily please ourselves. It means that not necessarily we please other people, but we please him. That is the priority. That is the focus. I'll leave you with a question. Will you say yes to God today? God bless you.